You're sitting somewhere right now. Maybe it's late. Maybe the light in the room is the kind that makes everything feel slightly unreal. That particular hour when the day hasn't quite ended, but hasn't become night either. And without meaning to, you've started running the calculation again, the one you run every few weeks. Where am I? What have I done with the time? Why does it feel like something is slipping? That feeling isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, the way a draft does, not a wind, just a change in temperature you notice when you stop moving long enough to feel it. Most people live their entire lives inside that feeling and never name it. They stay busy enough that it can't catch them. They fill the hours. They make the plans. They wake up and go through the motions of a life that looks, from the outside, like it's moving forward, and underneath all of it, something quiet and steady is being lost. Not to catastrophe, not to failure in any dramatic sense, but to friction, to drift, to the slow accumulation of small surrenders that never feel like surrenders at the time. Here's what nobody tells you. There's a game being played beneath the surface of ordinary life, not a conspiracy, not a secret kept by the powerful, just a set of principles, invisible, learnable, available to anyone, that a tiny fraction of people figure out, usually by accident, and that changes everything about how they move through the world. This isn't about hustle. It isn't about optimizing your morning or hacking your schedule. It's something quieter and harder and more permanent than that. What follows is a conversation, not a lecture. I'm not ahead of you. I'm just someone who's spent a long time studying the gap between the people who break through and the people who don't, and found that the gap is far smaller and far more specific than anyone wants to admit. Stay with me. Before we go deeper, take a quick second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always find it amazing how people from different parts of the world connect through these messages. Chapter 1. The System Beneath the Goal. There's a man I read about once, not famous, not remarkable in any external sense, who decided at 43 that he was going to learn to play the piano, not perform, not impress anyone, just play. He gave himself no deadline, no recital, no milestone to hit. He just sat down every morning for 20 minutes before his family woke up and worked through whatever was in front of him that day. 7 years later, he could play things that made people stop talking in the next room. Nobody called it discipline. He didn't either. He called it a Tuesday. That story stayed with me because it breaks something most of us believe without realizing we believe it. We've been taught to organize our lives around outcomes, lose the weight, make the money, build the relationship, get the promotion. We set the target, fix our eyes on it, and then measure every day by how close or far we are from it. And this seems rational. It seems like exactly the right way to operate. But there's a cost nobody mentions. When your life is organized around a goal, you live in a permanent state of not yet. The goal is always ahead, which means where you are is always behind, which means every morning you wake up slightly inadequate, not quite there, not quite enough, still working toward the thing that will eventually make it okay to feel good about yourself. That's an exhausting way to live, and it doesn't even work. Goals, it turns out, are remarkably bad at producing the results they promise. Not because ambition is wrong, but because goals are located in the future, and the future is the one place you can never actually act. You can only ever act now. And now is where systems live. A system isn't a plan. A plan is a map you drew before you knew the terrain. A system is a set of daily conditions you design so that the right actions happen almost automatically, not because you summoned the willpower, but because you built an environment where those actions are simply what comes next. The man at the piano didn't have a goal. He had a chair, a time, and a habit. The music was a consequence. Here's what changes when you make this shift. When your life is organized around a system rather than an outcome, today is never behind schedule. Either you showed up or you didn't. Either the daily work happened or it didn't. And if it happened, the day was a success, regardless of whether the result is visible yet, regardless of whether anyone noticed, regardless of how far you still are from wherever you thought you were going. This is harder than it sounds, because systems are quiet and outcomes are loud. The world celebrates outcomes. It photographs them, shares them, puts them on the highlight reel. Nobody posts about the Tuesday morning before the family woke up. Nobody talks about the 7 years of 20-minute sessions that made the music possible. We see the arrival, and we reverse engineer a story that makes it look inevitable. It wasn't inevitable. It was accumulated. I spent years chasing outcomes and wondering why the motivation kept collapsing. The goal would feel urgent for a few weeks, and then the urgency would dissolve, and I'd be left trying to remember why I cared. What I didn't understand then is that motivation is a response to progress, not a precondition for it. You don't feel motivated and then start. You start, you make progress, and the progress generates the feeling. But if the system isn't there, if the only thing pulling you forward is the distant image of the result, then on the days when the image fades, nothing moves. Build the system first, not the goal, the system. Ask not what you want to achieve, but what you want your days to look like. Because your days are your life, not the milestones, not the arrivals. The ordinary Tuesdays, stacked end to end, are what your life is actually made of. And here's the thing about systems that nobody tells you until you've lived it. They compound, not in the dramatic exponential way that gets put on motivational slides. Quietly, incrementally, the way a river cuts through stone, not by force, but by persistence. One Tuesday after another, until the landscape changes and you look up and don't recognize where you are. The goal keeps you looking at the peak. The system keeps your boots moving. Only one of those gets you to the top. Chapter 3. The Crowd's Consensus. Watch a flock of starlings change direction sometime, not in a nature documentary, in real life if you're ever lucky enough to catch it. One moment they're moving as a single dark wave across the sky, and then something shifts, and thousands of birds turn simultaneously. No leader, no signal anyone can see, just a ripple of consensus moving through the mass at the speed of proximity. It's beautiful. It's also exactly what most human decision-making looks like, except we're not birds, and the stakes are higher than which field to land in. Most people take their cues from the people closest to them. What career to pursue, what opinions to hold, what to want, what to fear, what counts as a reasonable life. These decisions feel personal because they happen inside our own heads. But trace them back far enough and you find they're mostly inherited, absorbed from the immediate environment without examination, the way you absorb an accent without ever deciding to speak that way. And here's the problem. The people around you are doing the same thing. They're taking their cues from their environment, which includes you. It's a closed loop. Everyone is looking to everyone else for confirmation, and what gets confirmed is whatever the average already is, the average outcome, the average ambition, the average life. This is not a conspiracy. Nobody is keeping anyone down. It's just the natural result of a social species optimizing for belonging rather than accuracy. The brain's deepest need is not to be right. It's to be included. And inclusion requires conformity. So we conform, mostly without knowing we're doing it, and we end up somewhere in the middle of wherever the people around us have landed, and we call that the natural result of our choices. The few who break through have a different relationship with consensus. And I want to be precise here, because the obvious misreading of this is to become contrarian, to do the opposite of whatever the crowd does reflexively, as a kind of identity. That's not independence. That's still crowd-defined behavior, just inverted. The contrarian is as oriented to the crowd as the conformist. They just face the other direction. Genuine independence is quieter than that. It's not reactive. It doesn't need the crowd to push against. It simply asks, before adopting any belief or behavior, is this actually true, or is this just what people around me do? That question, asked honestly and regularly, is one of the most subversive acts available to an ordinary person. Because once you start asking it, you start noticing things. You notice that most people are anxious most of the time about things that never actually happen. You notice that most people are in jobs they tolerate rather than work that engages them, and that this is treated as maturity rather than surrender. You notice that the financial habits, the relationship patterns, the ways people spend their Saturday afternoons, most of it is simply what was modeled, repeated, never questioned. And you start to realize that the path everyone is on wasn't designed by anyone. It just accumulated. Habit layered on habit, generation on generation, until it hardened into something that looks like wisdom, but is really just inertia wearing a respectable face. When everyone is buying, the few are watching. When everyone is panicking, the few are calm. When everyone is consuming, the few are building. Not because they're smarter, not because they saw something secret, but because they asked the question one more time than everyone else. Is this actually what I think, or is this just what I've been around long enough to believe? There's a particular courage required for this that nobody warns you about. Not the dramatic courage of the grand gesture. The quieter, lonelier courage of sitting in a room full of people who are certain about something you've started to doubt, and not performing the certainty they're performing. The courage to be unresolved in public. To say I don't know when everyone else has already decided. To walk a different direction without explaining yourself to people who are heading somewhere you've quietly stopped wanting to go. This takes practice. Because the pressure to conform is not experienced as pressure, it's experienced as common sense. The crowd's consensus always feels like reality until you step outside it, and then it feels like weather you used to think was the whole sky. Here's the exercise. Pick one belief you hold about what's possible for your life, something you've accepted as a realistic ceiling. Now ask, where did that belief come from? Not philosophically, specifically. Who said it? When? In what context? And why would that person have known? 9 times out of 10, you'll find it came from someone who was themselves operating inside a closed loop. Someone whose ceiling became yours because you were standing close enough to inherit it. The ceiling isn't structural, it's atmospheric. And atmosphere can change. Step far enough outside the consensus, and you stop navigating by what everyone else is doing. You start navigating by what's actually true. Chapter 4. The Time Horizon. Pick up any object near you right now. Doesn't matter what it is. A cup, a phone, a pen. Look at it for a moment. That object exists because someone at some point thought far enough ahead to imagine a need that didn't yet exist and built something to meet it. Not next week's need, not this quarter's need. A need that was years away, maybe decades, from the moment they sat down to think. Most of us never think that far. Not because we're incapable, but because nothing in daily life rewards it. The immediate is loud. The urgent is always arriving. The inbox, the notification, the bill, the conversation that needs a response by Friday, all of it pulls attention toward the near horizon and keeps it there. And so we make decisions calibrated for the short term, stack them end to end across years, and then look up one day, surprised by where we've landed, as if the destination had nothing to do with the direction we kept choosing. There's a concept in behavioral economics called hyperbolic discounting. What it describes is this: the brain doesn't evaluate future rewards on a linear scale. It doesn't say a reward in 10 years is worth slightly less than a reward today. It says a reward in 10 years is worth almost nothing compared to a reward right now. The curve isn't gradual, it's steep, which means the version of you making decisions about next decade is being systematically underrepresented in every choice you make today. Your future self has no vote. Your present self holds all the ballots. The few who think in decades aren't immune to this. Nobody is. The bias is neurological, not a character flaw. But they've done something intelligent in response to it. They've built structures that compensate for it. They've removed the decision from the moment of temptation and made it somewhere calmer, earlier, when the future self can actually get a word in. The investor who automates the transfer before the paycheck hits the account isn't more disciplined than you. They just understood that discipline isn't a reliable resource and stopped depending on it. The writer who blocks the first 2 hours of every morning before checking messages isn't more focused than you. They just understood that focus doesn't defend itself, so they defended it in advance. This is what long-term thinking actually looks like in practice. Not vision boards, not 10-year plans written in a journal and never opened again. Just the quiet, structural act of giving your future self a vote in your present decisions before the present moment drowns it out. And here's what shifts when you genuinely extend your time horizon. Small actions stop feeling small. When you're thinking in weeks, skipping the workout today is just skipping the workout today. When you're thinking in decades, it's a small revision to who you're in the process of becoming. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just a vote cast in a direction you didn't mean to vote. And votes accumulate. They always accumulate. The same reframe applies to learning. Reading for 20 minutes feels like almost nothing when you're measuring against this week. Measured against a decade, it's somewhere between 300 and 500 books, depending on what you read. That's not a library. That's a different kind of mind. You don't build it in a sitting. You build it in the accumulated weight of evenings that individually felt like they didn't count. I think about a conversation I had once with someone who had built something genuinely remarkable over 30 years. I asked him what the turning point was, expecting a story. He looked at me with something that wasn't quite patience and said, there wasn't one. Just a long time of doing the thing, and then, one day, the thing was done. I didn't know what to do with that answer for years. Now, it's one of the truest things I know. The crowd is obsessed with acceleration. Fast money, fast transformation, fast results, fast everything. And the economy that serves the crowd is built entirely around selling that acceleration. Every shortcut, every hack, every system that promises months of results in days. All of it exists because the demand for it is enormous, and the supply of actually fast transformation is essentially zero. Because the things that last are slow, not unnecessarily slow. Not slow because slowness is virtuous. Slow because they're real. A skill built over years is load-bearing. A skill acquired in a weekend is decorative. A body trained over a decade can do things in its 50s that a body trained in bursts never could. A relationship nurtured across time becomes something qualitatively different from one maintained by proximity and habit. Slowness in a world optimized for speed has become genuinely rare, and what's rare becomes valuable. Patience is not a personality trait. It's a competitive advantage, the willingness to stay in the building phase long after everyone else has lost interest. That willingness, more than talent, more than intelligence, more than connection, is what separates the finished from the abandoned. Extend your horizon and watch your daily choices reorganize themselves. The decade is already passing, whether you're thinking in it or not. Chapter 5. The Mental Operating System. There's a moment that happens sometimes in the middle of an argument. Not a big one, not a screaming match, just the ordinary kind of friction that happens between two people who spend enough time together where you catch yourself mid-sentence and realize with a quiet shock that you're not saying what you think. You're saying what you heard someone else say years ago in a completely different context to a completely different person. Your father's words in your mouth. Your first boss's logic in your reasoning. Someone else's conclusion delivered in your voice as if it were yours. That moment of recognition is rare. Most people never have it. And that's the problem. Your mind is running software you didn't write. This isn't a metaphor. It's as close to a literal description of cognitive architecture as plain language can get. Every framework you use to interpret experience, every assumption you carry about what's possible or safe or worth wanting, every default response to stress or failure or praise, almost none of it was chosen. It was absorbed from family, from school, from the particular neighborhood and particular decade and particular set of relationships that happened to surround you during the years when the brain was most plastic and most hungry to make sense of things. Psychologists call these schemas, mental structures that filter incoming experience before it reaches conscious thought. The world doesn't reach you directly. It reaches you through your model of the world. And the model was mostly built by other people in other times, for other purposes, without your consent and without your awareness. This is not a reason for despair. It's the most useful thing you can know about yourself. Because if the software was installed without your knowledge, it can also be examined without your permission. You don't need anyone's approval to question what you've inherited. You don't need a therapist or a guru or a program. You just need the habit, uncomfortable and specific, of asking when a belief surfaces, is this actually mine, or did I just never put it down? The few who break through have figured out something that sounds simple and turns out to be one of the hardest things a person can do. They've made the unconscious visible. They've learned to catch their own frameworks in the act of running, the way you catch an accent when you hear a recording of your own voice. And then, crucially, they've learned that catching it is enough. You don't have to fix it immediately. You don't have to replace it on the spot. The catching is already the beginning of distance, and distance is the beginning of choice. Here's what this looks like in practice. Someone cuts you off in traffic, and you feel a flash of rage disproportionate to the event. The untrained response is to follow the rage. The slightly more developed response is to notice the rage and suppress it, which is just a different kind of automatic. The genuinely upgraded response is to get curious about it, to ask not rhetorically, but actually, why does this particular stimulus produce this particular response in this particular magnitude? What belief about respect or control or fairness is sitting underneath that reaction? And does that belief actually serve you, or is it just familiar? That question, does this serve me, or is it just familiar, is one of the most powerful questions available to a human being. Because familiarity feels like truth. The thoughts you've thought 1,000 times feel like facts. The frameworks you inherited young feel like reality itself. They don't announce themselves as frameworks. They just feel like the way things are. The Stoics had a practice for this. They called it prososhe, attention to self, a kind of continuous non-judgmental observation of one's own inner movements. Not analysis, not criticism, just watching. The discipline of noticing what's running before deciding whether to follow it. Marcus Aurelius came back to this in his private journals again and again, not because he had mastered it, but because it required constant return. The software doesn't stop running just because you've seen it once. I used to think intelligence was the thing that separated the clear thinking from the muddled. I don't believe that anymore. Intelligence running on inherited frameworks just produces more sophisticated versions of the same errors. What actually separates the clear from the muddled is the willingness to examine what you're thinking with, not just what you're thinking. The tool is as important as the thought it produces, possibly more. Here's the practice. Once a day, not in a structured session, just in an ordinary moment, catch yourself mid-conclusion. Some small judgment you've just made, some assumption that arrived without being summoned, some prediction about how something will go. Hold it for a moment before acting on it and ask, where did this come from? Not as accusation, as genuine curiosity. Trace it back one layer, just one. You don't need the full archaeology, just the first root. Over time, the gaps between inherited reaction and chosen response get wider, slightly wider every week, and in those gaps, something starts to grow that didn't have room before. A mind that is actually yours. Chapter 6. Inversion. There's an old story about a bridge engineer who, when asked how he knew where to place the supports, said he didn't start by calculating where the weight should be held. He started by calculating where, if a support were missing, the whole structure would collapse. He mapped the failure first. The design followed from that. Most of us build our lives the other way around. We spend enormous energy imagining the best version of how things could go. The successful launch, the thriving relationship, the career that finally feels aligned. We visualize the outcome, we plan toward it, we motivate ourselves with the image of it. And this feels productive because it's active, it's optimistic, it's the kind of thinking that looks like ambition from the outside, but there's a flaw in it that doesn't show up until something goes wrong. Forward thinking, pursued exclusively, leaves your blind spots intact. Because when you're focused on the destination, you're not looking at the terrain. You're not asking what's between here and there that could end the journey before it starts. And the things that end journeys are almost never dramatic. They're small, predictable, the kind of thing that, if someone had pointed it out in advance, you'd have said, of course, obviously, why didn't I think of that? You didn't think of it because you were busy imagining the arrival. Charlie Munger, who spent decades studying how intelligent people make catastrophic errors, distilled his approach to a single instruction. Invert. Always invert. Don't ask how to succeed. Ask how to fail, specifically, concretely, embarrassingly. List every way the thing could go wrong. Then, don't do those things. What remains after you've eliminated the failure paths is something much closer to a reliable route than any forward projected plan. But here's what Munger's framing doesn't quite capture, and what I think matters more. The reason forward thinking fails isn't just that we miss the obstacles. It's that optimism, neurologically, suppresses the brain's risk detection function. When you're in a state of positive anticipation, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for consequence modeling, literally reduces its activity. You become, in that state, less capable of seeing what could go wrong, not less willing. Less capable, which means the very enthusiasm that drives you toward a goal is simultaneously blinding you to the landmines on the path to it. Pessimism, used correctly, is a precision instrument, not as a worldview, not as a permanent stance, but as a deliberate mode you switch into for specific periods of analysis. You ask, how does this fail? You make the list. You sit with the discomfort of that list rather than rushing past it, and then you switch back. The point isn't to kill the optimism. The point is to earn it. To let the optimism that survives a serious failure mapping be something sturdier than the optimism that preceded it. Here's what this looks like, applied to something real. Say you're thinking about starting something, a project, a business, a creative practice. The forward question is, what does success look like? The inverse questions are, what would guarantee this fails? What's the most likely reason I quit? What am I assuming that could be wrong? What would someone who wanted to see this fail say about it? And then Crucially, what's the smallest version of this that would tell me whether the core idea is sound before I've committed everything to it? Answer those honestly, and you haven't killed the project. You've stress-tested it. The things that survive honest stress testing are the things worth building. The crowd fantasizes about winning. They spend their planning energy on the podium moment, the launch day, the version of events where everything works. The few study losing. They know the failure modes by name before the project begins. And when something goes sideways, not if, when, they're not surprised and they're not destroyed. They've already thought about this. They already have a response. This is why the few seem calm in crises. It's not temperament. It's preparation. They've been to the failure scenario mentally many times before it arrived physically. The shock that flattens everyone else was already processed in advance. There's something uncomfortable about this practice that I want to name directly because I've watched people resist it in a specific way. Mapping failure feels, to the optimistic mind, like inviting failure, like you're somehow calling it toward you by imagining it. This belief is exactly backwards. The failure you haven't imagined is the one that finds you unprepared. The failure you've mapped in advance is the one you've already begun to survive. The engineer who knows where the bridge fails doesn't build a weaker bridge. He builds the only bridge that will hold. Ask the dark question first. Let the light one follow. What you build after that is something that actually stands. Chapter 7. The Identity Architecture. There's a particular Tuesday that most people have had but almost nobody talks about. You've decided to change something. The diet, the exercise, the morning routine, whatever it is this time. And for the first week, it goes well. Better than expected, actually, and you feel something close to pride. Then, Tuesday of the second week arrives. Nothing dramatic happens. There's no crisis, no catastrophe, no extraordinary temptation. The day is just ordinary, slightly tired, slightly busy. The thing you committed to doing requires a small amount of effort and delivers no immediate reward. And quietly, without ceremony, you don't do it. Not because you forgot, not because something got in the way, just because in that ordinary moment it turned out not to be who you are. That's the real problem with most attempts at change. Not lack of motivation, not lack of information, not even lack of discipline. Exactly. The problem is that the change was bolted onto an identity that never shifted. You tried to add a new behavior to an old self, and the old self, being the more established resident, eventually evicted it. The few who build habits that actually last have figured out something that takes most people years to stumble onto. Behavior change that doesn't begin with identity change is renovation on a condemned building. You can repaint every room. The structure is still wrong. In 1972, a psychologist named Daryl Bem proposed something that initially sounds strange, but becomes more convincing the longer you sit with it. He argued that we don't just infer other people's characters from their behavior, we infer our own character the same way. We watch what we do and conclude who we are. The self-image isn't fixed and then expressed through action. It's constructed continuously from the evidence of action, which means every small thing you do or don't do is quietly filing itself away as data. Your brain is building a case about you from your behavior, the way a biographer builds a portrait. And the portrait it constructs is what you believe yourself to be. And what you believe yourself to be is what you act like, which generates more data, which reinforces the portrait. The loop runs in both directions. This is why breaking promises to yourself is so much more costly than it appears. Not because of the missed workout or the skipped page or the avoided conversation, but because of what gets added to the file. Every small betrayal is evidence. Evidence that you're the kind of person whose commitments are negotiable. Evidence that when it's inconvenient, you don't follow through. And once that case is strong enough, the behavior it produces isn't weakness, it's accuracy. You're just acting like who you've concluded you are. The exit from this loop is not willpower. Willpower is trying to override the portrait with brute force. It works occasionally and exhausts you consistently, and the portrait remains. The exit is something quieter and more permanent. You change the evidence. Not dramatically, not all at once. You change it the way the portrait was built, one small piece of data at a time. You make one specific small promise to yourself, and you keep it. Not because it matters in itself, but because it files differently. It goes into the case as counter-evidence, as proof that maybe the portrait needs revision. And then you make another small promise, and you keep that one too. And the case starts to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Until one day, you catch yourself doing the hard thing without deliberating, without negotiating, without the internal argument you used to have every time. And you realize it wasn't discipline that got you there. It was identity. The behavior became an expression of who you are, rather than an effort to become someone you aren't yet. This is the sequence that actually works. Start with identity, not behavior. Not, I am trying to exercise more, but I am someone who moves their body every day. Not, I am trying to write, but I am a writer. Not, I am working on being more patient, but I am someone who chooses their response. The statement feels false at first. Say it anyway. Then act as that person would act, in the smallest possible way, and let the evidence accumulate. I want to be honest about something here. I resisted this for a long time because it sounded like the kind of affirmation psychology that I'd always found embarrassing. Standing in front of a mirror, telling yourself you're successful while your bank account says otherwise. That's not what this is. This is something more structural and less theatrical. You're not performing a future self. You're casting votes for one. The votes are behavioral, not verbal. The identity follows the action, not the declaration. The goal at the beginning is not results. Results are downstream. The goal at the beginning is to become, through accumulated evidence, someone for whom the behavior is simply characteristic. Someone for whom not doing it would feel like a departure, rather than the doing it feeling like an effort. That shift, when the habit stops being something you do and becomes something you are, is the moment everything changes, not just for that habit, for every habit that follows. Because now you're building from a different foundation. Now you're someone who follows through, and someone who follows through can build almost anything. The identity is the architecture. Everything else is just the rooms you fill it with. Chapter 8. Leverage. There's a particular exhaustion that's specific to people who work very hard and can't understand why it isn't enough. It's not the clean tiredness of physical labor, the kind that arrives at the end of a day when something was genuinely built. It's a heavier, more confused exhaustion, the kind that comes from doing everything right by every measure you were given, and still finding that the gap between effort and outcome refuses to close. You worked more hours, you stayed later. You said yes to more, slept less, pushed harder, and the needle moved, but not enough, never quite enough. Most people in that position conclude the problem is them, that they need to work harder still, that the gap exists because they haven't given enough, so they give more, and the gap remains because the gap was never about effort. It was about the relationship between effort and result, and that relationship for most people was never examined. Here's the thing, almost nobody tells you when you're young and being taught that hard work is the answer. Hard work is necessary, but it is not sufficient, and in certain configurations, it is actively misleading, because it produces results, just not proportional ones, and the non-proportionality is invisible when you're inside it. You see the work going in. You see the results coming out. The ratio never gets examined because the work ethic itself has become a moral value. Working hard is good. Working harder is better. Questioning whether you're working on the right thing in the right way feels like laziness wearing a philosophical disguise. It isn't. It's the most important question available to you. Leverage is the ratio between effort and result, and most people operating in linear mode, 1 hour of work producing 1 unit of result, never look for it because they don't know it exists. They were handed a map that didn't include it. The map said, work hard, be consistent, accumulate experience, wait your turn. And the map wasn't wrong exactly. It just described a route that takes 40 years to walk, when some routes take 10. There are 3 kinds of leverage worth understanding, and most people only ever access the first one accidentally. Mechanical leverage is systems and tools, anything that lets 1 unit of your effort produce results while you're doing something else. The email sequence that runs while you sleep. The process you documented once that your team now follows without you. The piece of writing that keeps finding new readers years after you finished it. Mechanical leverage doesn't require anyone else. It just requires the discipline to build the system rather than doing the task again. Human leverage is other people's effort, willingly extended in your direction, not exploitation, but genuine collaboration and trust. The colleague who refers work to you because you delivered once years ago. The mentor whose single conversation redirected a decade. The team that executes better than you could alone because you built something worth executing toward. Human leverage is slower to build than mechanical leverage and far more powerful because it compounds through relationships rather than through systems. But the third kind, reputational leverage, is the one almost nobody thinks about deliberately, even though it's operating in their life, whether they tend to it or not. Reputation is trust that has calcified into expectation. When someone with strong reputational leverage enters a negotiation, a room, a conversation, the work of establishing credibility is already done before they open their mouth. Years of kept promises and honest dealing have become a kind of permanent infrastructure. They don't rebuild trust in every new context. They import it. The problem with all 3 kinds of leverage is that they're invisible until they're substantial. You can't see mechanical leverage accumulating in a process you're building. You can't see human leverage growing in relationships you're tending. You can't see reputational leverage forming in the quiet record of how you've shown up over years. So most people don't invest in them. They invest in what's visible, what's measurable, what produces immediate evidence of progress. And they wake up a decade later wondering why the people who seem to work less ended up with so much more. The answer is almost always leverage, not luck, not talent, not connection in the sense of who you were born knowing, just a different relationship with the ratio. Here's what it looks like to start thinking this way. Instead of asking, how do I do this task well, ask, how do I build something that does this task without me? Instead of asking, how do I get better at this skill, ask, what would make this skill worth 10 times what it's currently worth to someone who needs it? Instead of asking, how do I meet more people, ask, what kind of person do I want to have the reputation of being, and am I being that consistently? These are not abstract questions. They have concrete answers, and the answers pursued steadily over years produce compounding results that have nothing to do with working harder. I worked for a long time without asking any of them. It cost me years I can't get back, not in dramatic failure, just in unnecessary friction. The kind of effort that could have been designed out if I'd been asking the right question earlier. Hard work without leverage is expensive exhaustion, wearing the costume of virtue. Find the ratio. Change the ratio. Then let the ratio work while you sleep. Chapter 9. The Invisible Web. There's a particular memory I return to sometimes. A wedding, years ago, where I found myself talking to someone I'd never met. A brief conversation, maybe 20 minutes, at a table near the back of a tent while the speeches went on too long. We disagreed about something. I can't even remember what, but in a way that felt generative rather than combative. We exchanged numbers. Life moved on. I thought about that conversation occasionally, but never did anything with it. 2 years later, completely sideways, through a chain of events I couldn't have predicted or engineered, that person's offhand mention of my name to someone they knew changed the direction of something I'd been trying to move for months. I didn't network my way to that outcome. I just hadn't let the thread go slack. Most people approach relationships the way they approach transactions. Something is needed, a connection is made, the need is met, or it isn't. The connection is filed away or discarded. The ledger is always running. Am I getting back what I'm putting in? Is this person useful to me? Is this worth my time? And other people feel this calculus instantly, even when it's never spoken. It comes through in the quality of attention, in the slight lag before enthusiasm, in the way the eyes move when someone more important enters the room. You've felt it from someone else, and you remember how it felt. The few who build genuinely powerful relational webs operate from a completely different question. Not what can I get from this person, but what does this person need that I might actually have? And then they give it, without tracking, without waiting, without the mental note that says, now they owe me one. They just give, and they move on, and they let the thing be what it is. This sounds naive until you watch it work over a decade. And then it looks like the most sophisticated strategy available. In 1973, a sociologist named Mark Granovetter published research that quietly upended everything people assumed about how opportunity moves through social networks. His finding, what became known as the strength of weak ties, was counterintuitive and precise. The connections most likely to change your life aren't your closest relationships. They're your most distant ones. The people you know well occupy the same information environment you do. They've heard the same things, know the same people, move in the same circles. The person you met once at a wedding and still occasionally message, they live in a completely different world. Different industry, different city, different set of conversations happening around them every day. And because you have a thread of warmth between you, however thin, you have access to that world in a way a cold introduction could never provide. But here's what Granovetter's research doesn't quite reach, and what I think is the more interesting layer. Weak ties aren't just information bridges, they're identity bridges. The people who know you well have already written a story about you. They carry an image of who you are that was formed in a particular context at a particular time and tends to be surprisingly resistant to revision. The person you barely know hasn't written that story yet. They meet you as you are now, not as you were when they first formed an impression. And sometimes that freedom, to be seen without the weight of your own history, is exactly what a new chapter requires. So tend the weak ties, not cynically, not as a strategy dressed in the clothes of friendship, but genuinely, with the understanding that people on the periphery of your life are not peripheral in their importance. They're nodes in a web that extends far beyond what you can see from where you're standing. The practice is embarrassingly simple. Think of 3 people you haven't spoken to in 6 months or more, not close friends. People from an earlier chapter, a former colleague, someone you met briefly at something and liked, a person whose work you followed for a while and then lost track of. Send each of them a short message. No ask, no agenda. Something like, I was thinking about that conversation we had. Hope you're well. What are you working on these days? That's the whole thing. You'll be surprised how often that lands somewhere real. Not because people are waiting by the phone for you specifically, but because genuine, unprompted connection has become genuinely rare. Most of what people receive is noise, automated, optimized, designed to extract something. A message that simply says, "I remembered you," with nothing wanted in return, cuts through that noise completely. It lands as a gift, because it is one. And here's the thing about giving in relationships that took me longer to understand than it should have. The return doesn't come from the person you gave to. It comes from somewhere else entirely, through a chain of events you couldn't trace, even if you tried. The reputation of being generous, being reliable, being someone who shows up without needing something back, that reputation travels through networks you're not in. It arrives in rooms before you do. It opens doors you didn't know existed through conversations you were never part of. You don't build this kind of web in a year. You build it across a decade of small, consistent acts of genuine attention. A birthday remembered, a piece of work noticed, an introduction made between two people who should know each other, with nothing in it for you, a check-in for no reason other than that you thought of someone and chose to say so. None of it is dramatic. All of it compounds. Plant enough seeds in enough different soils, and eventually the garden becomes something you couldn't have designed. You just have to keep showing up with water. Chapter 10. Emotional Mastery. There's a specific kind of damage that happens in the 45 seconds after you receive bad news. Not the hours of processing that follow, not the days of recalibration, just those first 45 seconds. The message that arrives wrong, the conversation that turns suddenly. The moment when something you expected to go one way goes decisively another. In those seconds, something floods through you that feels like clarity, but isn't. It feels like finally seeing the truth of things. It's sharp and certain, and it wants to act immediately, wants to respond, wants to make something happen right now before the feeling passes. Almost everything irreversible gets done in those 45 seconds. The Stoics had a concept they returned to constantly, never naming it quite the same way twice, but always circling the same territory. The space between what happens to you and what you do about it. Epictetus, who had been a slave and understood better than most what it meant to have no control over external circumstances, built his entire philosophy on a single distinction: what is within our power and what is not. Not as consolation, as the most precise map of human freedom available. Because once you're clear about what you cannot control, what remains is small and exact and entirely yours. That space between the stimulus and the response is not metaphorical. There's a physiological reality underneath it. When something triggers a stress response, cortisol and adrenaline flood the bloodstream. The body goes into a state that is, in evolutionary terms, designed for immediate physical action. And the chemistry of that state literally reduces the capacity for nuanced thinking. You become, in those first moments, less able to see complexity, less able to consider consequence, less able to access the values you'd claim to hold when nothing is threatening you. But here's the specific thing. That chemistry clears. 90 seconds, give or take, is all it takes for the initial wave to pass through the bloodstream and dissipate. 90 seconds of not acting, not responding, not sending the message, or saying the thing, or making the decision. And the body has already begun returning to a state where the prefrontal cortex can participate again, where you can choose rather than react. The few who develop genuine emotional mastery aren't people who feel less. That's the common misreading, that composure means diminishment, that steadiness requires suppression. It doesn't. The people I've watched handle genuinely hard things with the most grace are often the ones who feel the most acutely. They just don't let the feeling drive before it's had a chance to be understood. Feelings are not problems to be solved. They're signals to be read. And like any signal, they carry information that gets distorted when you act on them before processing them. Anxiety is usually pointing at something misaligned, a commitment made against your values, a direction that doesn't quite fit. Something you've been pretending is fine when it isn't. Anger is almost always pointing at a crossed boundary, either one you've stated and had violated, or one you've never articulated and are only now discovering you have. Sadness is pointing at something that matters. You can only grieve what you value, and grief, followed honestly, is one of the most reliable maps to what you actually care about. The emotion is not the problem. The problem is treating the emotion as a verdict rather than a messenger. Here's the practice, and it's simple enough to begin today. The next time a strong feeling arrives, not the gentle ones, the strong ones, the ones that want to act, don't reach for the phone. Don't distract. Don't immediately tell someone about it or analyze it or try to fix what caused it. Just locate it in your body first. Where is it sitting? What does it feel like physically, specifically, before you've applied any story to it? Is it in the chest, the throat, the stomach? Is it hot or cold? Does it have a quality of expansion or contraction? This isn't mysticism. It's just attention. And what attention does, almost immediately, is create the tiny gap between feeling and action that makes everything else possible. You can't choose your response while you're inside the feeling as if it were a room with no windows. You need to step far enough back to see the walls. Once you can see the walls, ask the question. Not why is this happening to me? That question is a cul-de-sac. It circles and produces nothing. Ask instead, what is this feeling trying to tell me about what I need or what I value or what I've been avoiding? Let the answer come without editing it. Often it's obvious once you stop fighting the feeling long enough to listen to it. Often the thing it's pointing at has been pointing for a long time. And then, this is the part that separates the practiced from the unpracticed. You choose the response. Not the one the feeling wants. Not the opposite of that either, because pure suppression is just a different kind of hijacking. The response that comes from your values rather than your nervous system. The response that you'd be comfortable with tomorrow, when the chemistry has cleared and the situation looks different in the light of a calmer day. The gap between feeling and response, that's not emptiness. That's where freedom lives. That's where the person you're trying to become gets to make the decisions instead of the person you're trying to leave behind. 90 seconds is all it takes to let the flood pass. Wait it out, then choose. Chapter 11. The body is the foundation. There's a particular moment in your mid-30s, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but it arrives for almost everyone, when the body stops being background and becomes foreground. Up until then, it was infrastructure, mostly invisible, running quietly beneath whatever else you were doing. You could ignore it, override it, borrow against it without immediately obvious consequence. And then, one ordinary morning, something is different. The recovery takes longer. The energy doesn't arrive on schedule. The sleep that used to restore everything restores less. Nothing dramatic. Just the first quiet indication that the account you've been drawing from without depositing has been keeping records. Most people treat this moment as an inconvenience. They adjust slightly, make a few cosmetic changes, and continue. What they've missed is that the body wasn't sending a complaint. It was sending a report. There's a concept in stress physiology called allostatic load. It describes the cumulative biological cost of chronic stress, poor sleep, inadequate nutrition, and insufficient recovery. The physiological debt that accumulates when the body's systems are repeatedly pushed beyond their capacity to restore. The insidious thing about allostatic load is that it's invisible during accumulation. The body absorbs the cost quietly, compensates, adapts, keeps functioning at something close to normal, until it doesn't. Until the compensation mechanisms themselves are exhausted and the bill arrives all at once, usually as illness or cognitive decline or an emotional fragility that seems to come from nowhere but has actually been building for years. The body doesn't send warnings, it sends a final notice. This is why treating physical maintenance as optional, as something you'll get to when things calm down, when the project is finished, when life allows, is one of the most expensive miscalculations available to a person who's trying to build something. Because the thing you're building runs on the body. Every decision you make, every creative problem you solve, every difficult conversation you navigate, every moment of patience or discipline or clear thinking, all of it is downstream of the biological state of the instrument producing it. A depleted body doesn't just perform worse, it perceives worse. It interprets ambiguous situations as threatening. It makes the difficult feel impossible, and the manageable feel overwhelming. It narrows the aperture through which you see what's available to you. Sleep is where this begins, and where most people most dramatically underestimate the cost of neglect. The research on sleep deprivation is now comprehensive enough to be uncomfortable. Even moderate chronic sleep restriction, the 6 hours a night that half the working population treats as sufficient, produces cognitive impairment equivalent to going without sleep entirely for 24 hours. Decision quality drops. Emotional reactivity increases. The capacity for nuanced thinking, for holding complexity, for choosing response over reaction, all of it degrades measurably in ways the sleep-deprived person cannot themselves detect. Which is perhaps the cruelest part. The damage impairs the very faculty that would allow you to notice the damage. Fix sleep first. Before the diet, before the exercise program, before anything else on the list. Not because it's the most glamorous intervention, it isn't, but because everything else you're trying to do is running on whatever sleep allows. A sharp, rested mind working on a mediocre plan will outperform an exhausted mind working on a brilliant one. Every time. Across a career, the difference isn't marginal, it's architectural. Movement comes next, and the thing worth understanding about movement is that its primary benefits aren't aesthetic, they're neurological. Exercise increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, sometimes called fertilizer for the brain, which supports the growth of new neural connections, improves memory consolidation, and is one of the most reliable interventions known for anxiety and depression. You're not moving to look different. You're moving to think better, feel more evenly, sleep more deeply, and extend the years in which all of the above remain available to you. The mirror is the least interesting thing the movement is doing. Food is simpler than the industry built around it wants you to believe. The body has been processing whole foods for a very long time. It knows what to do with them. What it doesn't know what to do with, what it handles at significant metabolic cost, is the volume of engineered, hyperpalatable, nutritionally hollow material that now constitutes the majority of what most people eat. Not because those people are careless or weak, but because the engineering is genuinely sophisticated and the signals it overrides are genuinely ancient. Eat mostly real things. Eat them slowly enough to notice how they make you feel. Let that feedback actually reach you rather than eating past it. That's most of what there is to know. And then, stillness. The one most people skip entirely because it produces no visible output and feels, in a culture that monetizes productivity, dangerously close to doing nothing. But the nervous system is not designed for continuous stimulation. It requires periods of genuine quiet, not sleep, not passive consumption, not the half-rest of scrolling, but actual stillness, where nothing is being processed, nothing is being performed, nothing is being optimized. 10 minutes a day of simply sitting, breathing, not reaching. Not to achieve a meditative state, just to stop. The nervous system, given that space, regulates itself in ways that no amount of active intervention can replicate. I ignored most of this for longer than I should have. I treated the body as a delivery mechanism for the mind, something to be maintained at minimum viable function while the real work happened elsewhere. The cost was subtle and then sudden, a period of burnout that took months to climb out of and left me with a clear understanding that the mind I was so busy using ran entirely on the body I'd been ignoring. The foundation isn't separate from what you're building. It is what you're building on, and everything built on a cracked foundation eventually tells you so. Chapter 12. The Long Game. There's a stone path near a monastery in Kyoto that has been walked by monks for 400 years. The stones in the center of the path are worn smooth and slightly concave, not by any single footstep, but by the accumulated weight of 4 centuries of ordinary mornings. Nobody walking that path on any given day was trying to shape the stone. They were just going where they needed to go. And the stone changed anyway, slowly, without anyone noticing in the moment. The evidence only visible when you look at what 400 years of small, consistent, unremarkable steps produces. That's the long game, not the dramatic version, the real one. Most people think of perseverance as a sustained emotional state, a continuous burning motivation that carries you through difficulty the way a strong wind carries a kite. They imagine the people who build remarkable things are in a constant state of inspired forward movement, energized by the vision, undeterred by the obstacles, waking every morning with the fire intact. And when their own fire fluctuates, when the motivation dims, when the progress is invisible, when the effort stops feeling connected to any discernible result, they conclude something is wrong with them. That they don't have what it takes. That the people who succeed must have something they don't. They don't. The people who build things over decades aren't in a constant state of inspiration. They're in a constant state of showing up. Angela Duckworth's research on grit, the combination of passion and perseverance for long-term goals, is useful, but I think it misses something important about how the people who actually go the distance operate. Duckworth frames it as sustained passion for a goal. But the people I've observed who've genuinely played the long game aren't sustained by passion for the goal. At some point, and this is the shift that changes everything, they stopped needing the goal to motivate them at all. The work became its own justification. They no longer do it to become someone. They do it because they already are that someone, and that person does this work. That's just what they do. This transfer of identity is the actual mechanism underneath what looks, from the outside, like extraordinary willpower or unusual discipline. It isn't willpower. Willpower is borrowed energy. It runs out. It requires replenishment. It fails under sufficient pressure. What these people have is something structural rather than energetic. The work is load-bearing. Remove it, and the identity collapses, which means they're not sustained by wanting to do it. They're sustained by the fact that not doing it would require becoming someone else. That's a different relationship with consistency than most people have ever experienced. And it doesn't arrive through decision or declaration. It arrives through time, through enough accumulated repetition that the behavior stops being something you do and becomes something you are. The same process as the identity architecture of the earlier chapter, but extended across years rather than weeks. The compounding of identity the way interest compounds, invisibly for a long time, and then suddenly and visibly all at once. Here's what the long game actually looks like from the inside, because the outside view is misleading. From the outside, the person playing the long game looks like they have unusual clarity, unusual focus, unusual patience. From the inside, it often feels like none of those things. It feels like uncertainty about whether any of it is working. It feels like watching people who started later somehow arriving at visible results sooner. It feels like the effort is disappearing into a void that gives nothing back. The bamboo underground, roots spreading in the dark, nothing showing, the surface completely still. The moment most people quit is not the moment of greatest difficulty. It's the moment of greatest invisibility. When the work is happening and the results aren't, and there's no external signal to indicate that the roots are spreading, that's when the story starts rewriting itself. Maybe this isn't working. Maybe I misread this. Maybe the people who told me this was possible were wrong, or I'm the exception, or I started too late, or the window has closed. The story is always plausible. That's what makes it dangerous. It wears the clothes of realism. And here's what I want to say about that moment, directly and without comfort. I can't promise you the results are coming. I don't know what you're building, or whether the specific form you're building it in is the right one. What I can tell you is that quitting in the invisibility phase guarantees the roots never break the surface. And staying imperfectly, inconsistently, sometimes at 40% of what you'd ideally bring, gives them the chance to. The math of small, consistent improvements is not intuitive. 1% better each day doesn't feel like anything. It doesn't produce evidence of its own accumulation. But compounded across a year, it produces something 37 times larger than where you started. And compounded across a decade, it produces something that has no relationship to the person who began. Not because of any single decision or any dramatic transformation. Just because of the Tuesday mornings. Just because of the unremarkable, unwitnessed, unglamorous accumulation of days in which the work happened. The competition, meanwhile, eliminates itself, not through failure in any dramatic sense, through the ordinary attrition of people who were playing for the short game, discovering that the short game doesn't pay out on the timeline they expected, and moving on to the next thing. And the next, each restart costing them the compound interest of everything they'd built. The long game wins, partly because of what it produces, and partly because almost nobody stays in it long enough to find out what it produces. Stay longer than feels reasonable. Stay past the point where the evidence supports staying. Stay into the invisibility and through it and out the other side. The stone in the center of the path didn't choose to be shaped. It just stayed where it was, while the years did their work. Chapter 13. The Art of Becoming Unreachable. There's a kind of person you've probably encountered once or twice in your life. Not famous, not particularly loud. But when they speak in a room, something shifts. Not because they demand attention, but because they've stopped needing it. They carry a quality that's difficult to name precisely. Not confidence in the performed sense, not the rehearsed ease of someone who's learned to appear comfortable. Something quieter and more permanent than that, as if they've arrived somewhere internal that most people are still searching for externally, and the arrival shows, the way a long journey shows in someone's face, not as exhaustion, but as a particular kind of settled knowing. What you're sensing in those people isn't success, it's sufficiency, and it's rarer than almost anything else you'll encounter in a lifetime. Most of us are running at some level on external validation. Not obviously, not in ways we'd readily admit. But the checking of the phone after posting something, the reading of the room after speaking, the quiet audit of how we landed with someone after a difficult conversation, these are all the same behavior in different clothes. We produce something, and then we wait to find out if it was okay. We act, and then we look to the reaction to tell us whether the action was worth taking. The loop runs so constantly and so quietly that most people don't experience it as dependency. They experience it as normal. It is normal. It's also, quietly, one of the most limiting forces in a person's life. Here's why. When your sense of whether something was worth doing depends on the response it receives, you've handed the editing function of your life to other people. Not any specific person, just whoever happens to be watching. And whoever happens to be watching is not a reliable editor. They're responding to their own needs, their own moods, their own frameworks for what's valuable. Their approval tracks their preferences, not your potential. Their silence doesn't mean the work was wrong. Their enthusiasm doesn't mean it was right. But if you're running on their signal, you'll shape yourself toward what gets the response and away from what doesn't. And slowly, without ever deciding to, you'll become a version of yourself optimized for approval rather than truth. The philosopher Epictetus, back to him again because he keeps being right, drew a distinction that I think is the most useful frame available for this particular problem. He divided all of human experience into two categories: what is up to us and what is not. What is up to us is vanishingly small. Our judgments, our intentions, our responses, our values, the quality of attention we bring to what we're doing. Everything else, other people's opinions, outcomes, circumstances, how things land, whether the work is recognized, not up to us, not even a little. This isn't resignation, it's precision. Because the moment you stop treating other people's responses as data about your worth and start treating them purely as information about their preferences, something remarkable happens to your relationship with your own work. You stop producing for the reaction. You start producing for the thing itself. And work produced for the thing itself has a quality that work produced for approval almost never achieves. Not because struggle is inherently ennobling, but because the internal compass that guides it is finally pointing at something real. The practical shape of this is specific. It means finishing the thing before showing it to anyone. Not for secrecy, but because the moment you introduce an audience into the creative or developmental process, the audience's imagined reaction begins editing the work. You start making choices not based on what's true or what's good, but based on what you think will land. And what lands and what's true are often not the same thing. The best work tends to be slightly ahead of the reaction it eventually receives. It gets there first and waits for the audience to catch up. But you can only make that work if you're willing to be in the uncomfortable position of not knowing how it will be received while you're making it. It means building the practice before building the audience. Most people reverse this. They want the following before they've developed the depth that would make the following meaningful. They want the recognition before they've built the thing worth recognizing. And so they perform the building rather than doing it. They document the process in ways designed to attract attention to the process, which splits the energy and compromises the output, and produces neither the depth nor the audience they were actually after. Build the thing. Build it in relative quiet. Build it until it's genuinely good by your own most honest assessment. The audience, if it's coming, will find it. And if it doesn't come in the form you expected, the thing will still exist, and its existence will have made you someone who built it, and that person is more capable than the one who was waiting for permission. There's a frame break I need to make here, and it's one I don't entirely have resolved. The line between healthy independence from external validation and unhealthy isolation from feedback is genuinely difficult to locate. I've erred in both directions. I've shared things too early and had the response reshape something that should have been left alone. I've also held things too long in private and lost the perspective that would have improved them. I don't have a clean answer to where exactly the line is. What I have is a rough heuristic. Share for improvement, not for reassurance. When you're genuinely uncertain how to make something better, other eyes help. When you're anxious about whether it's good enough, other eyes just transfer the anxiety without resolving it. The goal isn't to become impervious to feedback. It's to become clear enough about your own standards that feedback becomes useful information rather than the verdict you've been waiting for. And underneath all of this is something even simpler and harder. The people who become genuinely unreachable in the sense of no longer being destabilized by whether the world is currently approving of them aren't people who stopped caring. They're people who transferred their caring from the response to the work, from the reception to the quality of what they brought, from the outcome to the integrity of the process. That transfer doesn't happen in a decision. It happens in the accumulated experience of doing the work when no one is watching and finding that it mattered anyway, of finishing something that nobody saw and knowing it was good, of keeping a standard privately that you could have quietly lowered and chosen not to. Each of those moments files away as evidence, not of talent, but of a relationship with the work that doesn't depend on the world to validate it. Build that relationship long enough, and you become someone who cannot be reached by ordinary disapproval. Not because you've stopped feeling it, because you've found something that matters more. Chapter 14. The discipline of enough. There's a specific restlessness that follows achievement, not the restlessness of failure. That one is obvious. It announces itself. It has a clear direction it wants you to move in. This one is subtler and, in some ways, more dangerous. You reach the thing you were reaching for. The goal lands. The project finishes. The number hits. The recognition arrives. And for a moment, sometimes a day, sometimes a week, it feels like you thought it would feel. And then, quietly, almost before the feeling has finished arriving, something in you is already scanning the horizon for the next thing, already measuring the current position against a new and further one, already making the thing you just built into the floor rather than the ceiling. Most people experience this and conclude the answer is a bigger goal. They assume the restlessness means they didn't reach high enough, that the dissatisfaction is a signal to want more, to push further, to raise the bar again. And so they do. And they reach that thing too, and the restlessness returns unchanged at the new altitude. At no point does anyone stop to ask whether the restlessness is pointing forward or whether it's pointing inward. The Stoics had a word, autarkia, that translates roughly as self-sufficiency, but the translation flattens it. What they meant was closer to this: a condition in which your sense of being okay does not depend on external circumstances being arranged in any particular way. Not indifference to outcomes, not the absence of preference, just the radical, disciplined understanding that the okayness you're seeking through the next achievement is not located in the achievement. It never was. And chasing it there is not ambition. It's a very sophisticated form of avoidance. This is one of the hardest things to say in a conversation about getting ahead, because it sounds like an argument for settling. It isn't. The discipline of enough has nothing to do with lowering standards or abandoning ambition or making peace with mediocrity dressed as contentment. It's something far more specific and far more difficult than any of those things. It's the capacity to want the next thing without needing it, to pursue the goal without making your fundamental okayness contingent on its arrival, to build without the building being the only thing that makes you feel like you're not behind. Here's the distinction that matters. There are two kinds of striving, and they look identical from the outside, but feel completely different from the inside, and produce completely different results over time. The first kind comes from deficiency, from a background sense that something is wrong, that you are not enough, that the achievement will fix the wrongness if you can just reach it. This kind of striving has enormous energy in the short term. The deficiency is a powerful fuel. But it's a fuel that requires constant replenishment, because the achievement never actually addresses the deficiency. It just temporarily distracts from it. And so the person driven by deficiency keeps achieving and keeps feeling at some quiet level like it isn't enough, because they are not pursuing success. They are fleeing inadequacy. And you cannot outrun something that travels with you. The second kind of striving comes from a different place entirely. Not from the absence of something, but from the presence of something. genuine curiosity, genuine craft, genuine care about the work and the people it reaches. This kind of striving doesn't need the outcome to justify the effort, because the effort is already its own justification. The result matters, but it doesn't carry the full weight of the person's sense of themselves. Which means when it arrives slowly, or in a different form than expected, or not at all in one particular attempt, the person is disappointed without being destroyed. They can absorb the gap between what they hoped and what happened without the gap becoming a verdict on who they are. The first kind of person builds faster in the short term. The second kind builds further in the long term, and the further always wins, given enough time. I want to be careful here because I've watched this idea get misused. The discipline of enough is not a reason to stop. It's not a philosophy of low effort or convenient acceptance. The most disciplined people I've encountered in any field are almost always people who have found a way to care deeply about the work without their identity living or dying in the results. They work harder than the people driven by deficiency, often, but they work differently. They work from abundance rather than from lack. And that difference in the source of the energy changes the quality of the decisions made along the way. Because here's what deficiency-driven striving does to decision-making over time. It makes you risk-averse in the ways that matter most. When your sense of yourself is on the line with every outcome, you start protecting the outcomes rather than pursuing the best work. You start making the safe choice, the legible choice, the choice that's easiest to defend if it goes wrong. You stop taking the swings that could produce something genuinely new, because genuinely new things carry genuine uncertainty, and genuine uncertainty is too expensive when your okayness is already mortgaged to the result. The people who produce the most interesting, most durable, most genuinely useful work are almost always people who have developed enough internal sufficiency to tolerate the uncertainty of honest effort. They can make the choice that might fail, because failing, while unpleasant, doesn't hollow them out. Their foundation isn't built on outcomes. It's built on the integrity of how they showed up. Here is the practice, and it's one that runs against almost every instinct a high-achieving person has. Once a week, sit with what's already here. Not in a performative gratitude exercise, not in a way that requires you to feel something you don't feel. Just an honest accounting. What exists right now? In your skills, your relationships, your work, your understanding. That didn't exist 5 years ago. Not what's missing. What's present. Not what you haven't reached. What you've built. Most people in pursuit of the next thing never do this. They treat the present as a waiting room for the future, a temporary condition to be endured until the real life begins. The life that begins when the goal lands, when the number hits, when the thing finally works out. That life is always just ahead, and ahead is always where they're looking. The discipline of enough isn't about stopping the looking. It's about being genuinely present where you are while you look, about letting what exists now have its full weight, rather than treating it as merely provisional. About understanding that the future you're building toward is being built by a person who exists right now, today, in a life that is already real and already worth inhabiting fully. Want more. Build more. Reach further. But don't let the reaching be the only thing that makes you feel like you're alive. You're somewhere again now. Maybe the same room as when you started. Maybe somewhere different. The light has probably changed. Some amount of time has passed that you spent differently than you might have otherwise. Here's what I want to leave you with, and I'll say it plainly because you've earned plainness by now. Nothing in what we've covered is complicated. Systems over goals. Discomfort as teacher. The crowd as a compass pointing somewhere you don't want to go. A time horizon wide enough to make today's choices legible. Inherited software examined and slowly rewritten. Failure mapped before it arrives. Identity built one kept promise at a time. effort aimed at leverage rather than volume, relationships tended like a garden, given to without ledger, emotions read as signals rather than obeyed as commands, the body maintained as the foundation it actually is, and then the long, quiet, unglamorous commitment to staying in the work long after the feeling that started it has gone. None of it is secret. None of it requires anything you don't already have. What it requires is the one thing that can't be given, can't be hacked, can't be optimized into existence. The decision to begin, and then the daily renewal of that decision when beginning stops feeling new. There's a fork here, and I won't pretend it isn't real. One path leads back to the life that was already running before you started reading. The familiar loops, the comfortable drift, the slow accumulation of days that feel like they're going somewhere without quite arriving. That path is easy to find. It's already there. The other path starts smaller than you want it to. One action, not a plan, not a declaration, not a restructured morning routine announced to no one. One specific, concrete, slightly uncomfortable thing done in the next 24 hours in the direction of the person you already know you're capable of becoming. You know what it is. You've known since somewhere around the 3rd chapter. Go do that one thing, then come back tomorrow and do the next one. The rest of your life is being built right now in whatever you do next. This is where most people stop, but this is exactly where your work begins. Knowledge means nothing without action. Discipline means everything when no one is watching. If you made it this far, you're already different. So like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment below with one action you're going to take after this. Make it real. Make it count. Now go and prove it to yourself. I'll see you in the next one.